The crowd gathered like vultures around fresh carrion in the dusty main street of Copper Ridge. Beneath the scorching noon sun, a heat that shimmered in waves from the packed earth and warped the distant shapes of the mesas. 19-year-old Cordelia Walsh stood trembling on the auction platform. The rough-hewn planks were hot beneath the thin soles of her worn boots, and her pale hands clutched the faded, mended fabric of her only dress. A calico print whose cheerful flowers had long ago surrendered to the pervasive dust and relentless sun. But this wasn't a cattle auction where beasts were prodded and priced with detached professionalism. This was something far more sinister, an older, fouler transaction that made the air itself feel thick and tainted. Silas Blackwood leaned against a splintered saloon post, a study in predatory stillness. The sun caught the gold caps on his teeth, which gleamed as he smiled at his prize. He was a man built of sharp angles and dark intentions, his tailored black coat an absurd affectation in the oppressive heat, yet no one would dare comment on it. The debt was clear, a matter of public record and private shame. Her guardian, a man who had taken her in after her mother's death and who she had once mistaken for family, had a gambling addiction that had consumed him like a fever. It had cost him his small ranch, his dignity, and finally, the last thing of value he possessed. Now, Cordelia would pay the price. The town watched in a profound, uncomfortable silence, a community held captive by a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. Sheriff Morton, a man whose weary face seemed carved from the same tired landscape, prepared to hand over the terrified girl to settle a debt that should never have involved human flesh. He fiddled with the paperwork on his podium, his eyes refusing to meet hers. The rustle of the pages, a flimsy shield against the enormity of the injustice he was about to officiate. Cordelia's mind raced with desperate, fragmented thoughts. A frantic bird trapped in the cage of her skull. How had it come to this? 3 months ago, she was a fixture of quiet hope in the small town, helping Mrs. Patterson with her bakery. Her hands dusted with flour, the warm scent of rising bread, a comforting constant in her life. She dreamed of maybe teaching school someday, of sharing the books her mother had taught her to love with a new generation of Copper Ridge children. Now she stood like livestock, her future a commodity about to become the property of the most brutal man in 3 counties. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, painful rhythm against the wall of her chest. She could feel Blackwood's cold, possessive eyes traveling over her body, not with desire, but with the chillingly detached gaze of a merchant calculating his investment. He was assessing her health, her strength, her capacity for work, and for enduring his cruelty. The sheriff cleared his throat, a dry, rasping sound that did little to break the tension. He steadfastly avoided Cordelia's pleading gaze, a gaze she was sure was screaming what her voice could not. Everyone knew what Silas Blackwood did to the women who fell into his hands. His ranch was a place of whispers and shadows, a place from which no happy stories ever emerged. The last girl, a saloon singer with a similar debt, had lasted 6 months before she was found floating face down in Mill Creek, her body bruised and broken. The official verdict was a tragic accident, but the town knew better. They knew it was murder, just as they knew they were powerless to stop it from happening again. But debts were debts, solemn contracts etched into the unyielding stone of frontier law. And the law was the law, even when it stank worse than a week-old corpse rotting. In the sun, Blackwood pushed himself away from the post, the lazy movement belying the coiled energy within him. He began walking toward the platform, his silver-chased spurs jingling with each confident, deliberate step. The sound was a death knell in the stifling silence. The crowd parted before him, a human sea receding from a shark. It was not a gesture of respect that cleared his path. Fear had a way of clearing paths just as effectively. Cordelia's legs, which had been trembling, now threatened to give out entirely. A wave of dizziness washed over her as she watched her fate approaching, a man in black with gold teeth and dead eyes. She thought about running, a primal urge that screamed through every fiber of her being. But where could she go? The vast, unforgiving desert stretched for miles in every direction, an ocean of sand and rock and scorching heat. She had no money, no family left to turn to, no protection in a world that saw her as less than nothing. Her guardian, drunk as usual, cowered, somewhere behind the crowd, a pathetic, shadowy figure, unable to meet her eyes after selling her future for another bottle and a few more hands of cards. Just as Blackwood reached the bottom step of the platform, his hand already extended, the leathery skin and thick fingers ready to claim his prize. A voice cut through the stagnant morning air like a blade through silk. "Hold on there, Silas." The voice was not loud, but it possessed a quality of gravel and quiet authority that seized every ounce of attention in the street. Every head turned in unison, a synchronized movement of shock and disbelief. Standing at the edge of the crowd, as if he had materialized from the heat haze itself, was Marlowe Thorne. He was the man nobody wanted to cross, the man whose name was spoken in hushed tones in saloons and around campfires. The ghost of Copper Ridge. His weathered face, tanned to the color of old leather by years in the sun, was set in stone. His gray eyes, the color of a stormy sky, were fixed on Blackwood with an intensity that made even the bravest men in the crowd feel a sudden, primitive urge to take a step back. But what Marlowe said next would change everything. It would not only shatter the grim proceedings of the day, but would also begin to unravel a secret that had been buried in the hard-packed dirt of Copper Ridge for 20 long years. Marlowe stepped forward, moving through the crowd that parted. For him, just as it had for Blackwood, though the reason was subtly different. If fear cleared the way for Blackwood, it was a deeper, more complex awe that made a path for Marlowe Thorne. His boots made no sound on the packed dirt, a testament to a life lived with caution and purpose. The townspeople instinctively moved aside, creating a wide, empty corridor that stretched from the edge of the crowd to the auction platform, a dueling ground of unspoken history and imminent conflict. Everyone knew the stories about Marlowe Thorne, embellished with each telling, until the man had become a living legend. He was the man who'd killed 3 claim jumpers with his bare hands after they'd tried to steal his stake. He was the man who'd single-handedly burned down a corrupt sheriff's office in Deadwood, not for profit, but for a principle no one quite understood. He lived alone, on his sprawling, isolated ranch, a place said to be populated only by the ghosts of his past. Ghosts that no one dared name. Blackwood's confident smirk, the one that had terrorized Cordelia moments before, faltered for just a moment, a flicker of uncertainty in his cold eyes. Then it returned, full force, uglier for its brief absence. He had been waiting for a confrontation like this for years, ever since Marlowe had publicly embarrassed him at a high-stakes poker table, costing him a fortune and, more importantly, a measure of his fearsome reputation. Now seemed like the perfect time to settle old scores, in the public arena of the main street, in front of the whole town. Well, well, Blackwood sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. He let his hand drop from his side to rest casually on the polished handle of his gun belt. The hermit crawls out of his hole. You've got no business here, Thorne. This is between me and the girl's guardian. A legal transaction. Marlowe's gray eyes never left Blackwood's face as he continued his steady, unhurried approach. The silence, stretched tight as a hangman's rope. The air grew thick with unspoken threats, an electric charge that seemed to crackle between the two men. Even the horses tied to the hitching posts seemed to sense it, stamping nervously and shaking their heads, their harnesses jingling like worried chimes. The business I got here, Marlowe said quietly, his voice carrying with an effortless power that belied its low volume, is that the debt's been paid. A murmur rippled through the crowd like wind through dry wheat. Heads turned, whispers were exchanged. Paid? How could it be paid? The sum was astronomical for a town like Copper Ridge. Sheriff Morton stepped forward, his expression a mask of confusion and concern. The lawman had seen enough standoffs in his long career to know when violence was about to explode, and right now, the air felt ready to ignite. Now, hold on, Marlowe, the sheriff said, trying to keep his voice steady and authoritative, a task that grew more difficult by the second. This here's a legal matter. The girl's guardian, he owes Blackwood near $2,000. That's more money than this whole town sees in 6 months. Marlowe stopped, now standing just a few yards from the platform. He reached slowly into the inner pocket of his worn duster coat, a movement that caused several men in the crowd to instinctively step back and touch the handles of their own weapons. But instead of iron, he pulled out a heavy leather pouch that clinked with the unmistakable, melodic sound of gold coins. He didn't count them. He didn't offer it. He tossed it at the sheriff's feet, where it landed with a heavy, solid thud that seemed to echo off every sun-bleached building in town. The sound was one of finality, of undeniable substance. Count it, Marlowe said simply. Cordelia watched in stunned, breathless disbelief. Hope, a feeling she thought had been extinguished forever, flickered painfully back to life in her chest. The sheriff, after a moment's hesitation, knelt on the dusty street and untied the leather drawstring. Gold eagles, gleaming and beautiful, spilled onto the dirt. More money than she'd ever seen in her entire life. The brilliant afternoon sun caught the coins, sending dazzling flashes of light dancing across the mesmerized upturned faces of the crowd. It was a dragon's hoard, a mythical treasure made real in the middle of their dusty, workaday world. Blackwood's face had turned the color of raw beef. His carefully constructed theater of power was crumbling before his eyes, and everyone could see it. The foundation of his authority and questionable wealth and the enforcement of debt had just been washed away by a river of gold. But Silas Blackwood didn't become the most feared man in the territory by accepting defeat gracefully. That's real touching. Thorne, he snarled, his hand now openly hovering over the grip of his Colt, his knuckles white. But some things ain't for sale. I had a legal agreement. The girl was forfeit, and I intend to honor it. The crowd began backing away in earnest now, sensing the storm was about to break. Mothers, who had been craning their necks for a better view, now grabbed their children and pulled them behind buildings. Shopkeepers who had been standing in their doorways quietly retreated into the shadows of their stores. The street was clearing, leaving only the central players in the deadly drama. Only Cordelia remained frozen on the platform, a statue of terrified hope, caught in the crossfire between salvation and catastrophe. Asterisk, Marlowe took another step closer to Blackwood, closing the distance until their confrontation became personal, intimate, and deadly. They were close enough to smell the whiskey on Blackwood's breath, close enough to see the 20 years of hate simmering in his eyes. But neither man, not the vengeful tyrant nor the mysterious savior, was prepared for what Cordelia was about to reveal. A truth that would expose the real reason Marlowe Thorne had lived like an outcast for 2 decades. A truth that would change the very ground they stood on. Asterisk, Cordelia's voice, no longer trembling but infused with a desperate strength she didn't know she possessed, cut through the tension like a church bell on a Sunday morning. Clear, resonant, and impossible to ignore. Asterisk, he's my father. Asterisk, the words hit the crowd like a physical blow, a lightning strike from a clear blue sky. Every simmering conversation died. Every breath was caught and held in 100 lungs. Even the wind seemed to pause its dusty dance. 20 years of carefully buried secrets, of whispered rumors and forgotten sorrows, clawed their way to the surface in the broad, unforgiving daylight. Marlowe's granite expression, the stoic mask he had worn for as long as anyone could remember, cracked for the first time. A fissure of pure shock and disbelief ran through it. His weathered hands, hands that could break a man or gentle a wild horse, trembled slightly as he looked up at the girl on the platform. He really looked at her, not as a debt to be settled or a damsel to be rescued, but as a person, a woman. And in her face, he saw what everyone else was now seeing with a sudden, shocking clarity. The same storm gray eyes, the same stubborn set to her jawline, the same way of holding her shoulders square and defiant when cornered. Asterisk, Sheriff Morton's mouth hung open like a barn door in a storm. That ain't possible, he stammered, his mind struggling to reconcile the town's established history with this impossible revelation. Marlowe Thorne ain't got no family. Everyone knows that. Asterisk, but Cordelia was already climbing down from the platform, her movements urgent, clumsy, in her desperation to close the distance. To make them believe. My mother was Elizabeth Walsh, she announced, her voice gaining volume and conviction. She worked at the hotel, 20 years ago. She told me, before she died, she told me who my real father was. Asterisk, the crowd, which had backed away from the threat of violence, now pressed closer, their fear momentarily overcome by a ravenous hunger for the details of this long-hidden scandal. This was better than Christmas, and the 4th of July rolled into one salacious, gossip-soaked package. Asterisk, Blackwood's face had gone from red to purple to a sickly mottled white. His carefully laid plans weren't just falling apart. They were exploding in his face like a faulty stick of dynamite. You're lying, he spat, but his voice lacked conviction. He was reeling, off balance. Elizabeth Walsh was a whore who took money from half the men in this territory. Asterisk, Marlowe moved so fast that most people missed it. It was a blur of righteous fury. 1 second, he was standing 10 feet away, a statue of shock. The next, his fist connected with Blackwood's jaw with a sickening wet crack, a sound like an axe hitting hardwood. The brutal man spun twice from the force of the blow before crumpling to the dirt, blood streaming from his split lip and staining his teeth a grisly crimson. Asterisk, watch your mouth when you speak about her, Marlowe growled, his voice a low, dangerous rumble as he stood over Blackwood's prone form. Elizabeth was worth 10 of you. Asterisk, Cordelia reached them just as Blackwood was struggling to his feet, his hand instinctively reaching for the gun at his hip. But Sheriff Morton, galvanized into action, stepped between them. His own weapon was drawn, though pointed at the ground in a clear warning. That's enough, the lawman shouted, his voice finally regaining its command. Everybody calm down before somebody gets killed. Asterisk, Blackwood wiped a smear of blood from his mouth with the back of his hand. His eyes burned with a humiliation that was far more potent than the physical pain. Being knocked down in front of the whole town was bad enough. But being knocked down in defense of a dead woman's honor, a woman he had despised, was the kind of insult that demanded a blood payment. Asterisk, this ain't over, Thorne, he snarled, backing slowly toward his horse, his eyes never leaving Marlowe. Not by a long shot. That girl owes me, and I always collect what's mine. Asterisk, as Blackwood hauled himself onto his horse and galloped away in a cloud of vengeful dust, Cordelia finally stood face to face with the father she had never known, the reunion she had sometimes dared to dream of. A bittersweet fantasy in the lonely hours of the night was about to become a waking nightmare. They had won the first battle, but in his retreat, Blackwood had left behind the promise of a war, and neither of them could yet imagine the hell he was about to unleash upon them all. Asterisk, the crowd began to disperse, but their hushed, excited whispers followed them like dust clouds after a stampede, ensuring the story would be all over the county by sundown. Marlowe stood awkwardly before Cordelia, this formidable man who could face down armed killers without flinching, yet seemed utterly terrified of his own daughter's expectant gaze. The 20 lost years between them formed a chasm, wide and deep and filled with unspoken questions. Asterisk, Elizabeth, she never told you anything else about me? Marlowe asked quietly, his voice rougher than usual, as if scraped raw by the effort of speaking. The weight of those 2 decades, a mountain of regret and self-imposed loneliness. Pressed down on his shoulders, Cordelia shook her head, her own emotions a warring tumult of hope, fear, and a profound aching sadness for the man standing before her. Just your name, she replied, her voice soft, and that you were a good man who'd gotten a bad reputation. She made me promise. Promise never to look for you, unless her voice trailed off, the words catching in her throat. Unless what? Marlowe pressed gently. Unless I had no other choice. The devastating honesty in her words hit Marlowe harder than Blackwood's fist, harder than any bullet he had ever taken. Here was his daughter, his own flesh and blood. And she had only sought him out as a last resort, an act of sheer desperation. 20 years of self-imposed exile, 20 years of telling himself he was protecting her by staying away, suddenly felt like the coward's choice it had always been. Sheriff Morton, still trying to process the day's impossible events, cleared his throat. Marlowe, I got to ask, did you know about the girl? Marlowe's gray eyes found Cordelia's face again, memorizing the features he should have watched grow and change over 2 decades. He saw the curve of her cheek, the light in her eyes, and it was like looking at a ghost. Elizabeth came to see me once, about 19 years ago, he confessed, the memory painful and clear. Said she was carrying my child but didn't want nothing from me. Said a man like me, with my past, and the men who looked for me, would only bring trouble to a baby. The pain in his voice was so raw, so exposed, that even the few hardened cowboys who lingered nearby looked away, granting him a moment of privacy. She was protecting you, Cordelia whispered, understanding her mother's sacrifice in a way she never could have before. From the bounty hunters, from the men who wanted you dead. Before Marlowe could respond, a new commotion erupted at the end of the street. Young Tommy Patterson, the baker's son, came running down the street as if his pants were on fire, his face pale with panic. The boy skidded to a stop in front of the sheriff, gasping for breath and pointing back toward the edge of town from where he'd come. Sheriff Morton, you got to come quick. There's riders coming. At least a dozen of them, and they're flying Blackwood's colors. The blood drained from Marlowe's face. He knew Silas Blackwood had never been the type to accept defeat gracefully, but bringing an army back to Copper Ridge was more than simple revenge. This was an escalation, a declaration of war. He was planning something far worse than a simple fight. He was planning an annihilation, a message written in blood and fire that would echo across the entire territory. Sheriff Morton instinctively checked the loads in his gun and looked around at the handful of men still in the street. Most of the townspeople had already scattered to the relative safety of their homes and businesses. Sensing that trouble was riding in with the dust clouds on the horizon. How much time we got, boy? Morton asked, his voice grim. Maybe 10 minutes, Sheriff. They're riding hard, and they look mean. Marlowe's mind, honed by years of survival, was already calculating odds, sightlines, and escape routes. 1 man against 12 was suicide. Taking Cordelia and running seemed the only logical choice, but it would mean abandoning the town that, for all its flaws, had given him a place to exist. The decision should have been easy. Save his daughter and let Copper Ridge fend for itself. But as he looked into Cordelia's eyes, he saw something that changed the equation entirely. She wasn't afraid. Not anymore. She was angry, a deep, righteous anger that mirrored his own, and she was looking at him not as a savior to run behind, but as a partner, expecting him to fight. The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew from a distant rumble to a threatening thunder, and with it came the certain promise of violence, a reckoning, that would test every choice Marlowe Thorne had made in the last 20 years. The thunder of hoofbeats grew closer, a drumbeat of impending doom, as Marlowe made a decision that would define the rest of his life. Instead of turning to flee, he turned to face the approaching storm, and he felt his daughter take a position by his side. Cordelia, get behind the water trough, he ordered, his voice, a low command meant to brook no argument, but she didn't move. I'm not hiding anymore, she said, her voice firm, imbued with a resolve that startled him. These men came for me. I won't let innocent people die because I'm a coward. Marlowe felt a surge of fierce pride mixed with gut-wrenching terror. She had Elizabeth's courage and his own stubborn streak, a combination that was as noble as it was likely to get her killed. The bitter irony wasn't lost on him, that after 20 years of deliberately avoiding fatherhood to keep her safe, his first real conversation with his daughter might also be his last. Sheriff Morton positioned himself beside Marlowe, his weathered hand steady on the worn stock of his rifle. You know, Thorne, he said, not taking his eyes off the end of the street, I always figured you for a loner, a man apart. Never thought I'd see you make a stand for anybody else. Neither did I, Marlowe admitted, checking the cylinder of his Colt for the 100th time, the familiar weight a small comfort. But some things are worth dying for. The riders appeared at the end of Main Street, a vision from hell, silhouetted against the declining sun. 12 men, all heavily armed, with Silas Blackwood at their head. mounted on a black stallion that seemed to breathe violence. Dust swirled around them like malevolent smoke, and the late afternoon sun caught the polished metal of their weapons, turning them into cold, gleaming harbingers of death. As they drew closer, Marlowe could see this wasn't just about Cordelia anymore. Blackwood's eyes, swollen and burning in his bruised face, held the kind of all-consuming hatred that demanded bloodlots of it. This was about restoring his shattered respect, about reclaiming his territory, and about showing the entire territory what happened to men who dared to cross Silas Blackwood. The riders spread out, fanning across the width of the street, a grim armed net closing around the small group of defenders. Most of the townspeople had barricaded themselves inside, but Marlowe could see the dark barrels of rifles poking through second-story windows and from behind curtains. Copper Ridge might be small and generally timid, but it wasn't entirely defenseless. It seemed his stand had inspired some courage in others. Blackwood dismounted slowly, dragging out the moment, savoring the feeling of overwhelming power like a fine whiskey. His split lip had swollen grotesquely, twisting his smile into an even more pronounced sneer. Well, the great Marlowe Thorne, making his last stand, and all over a bastard girl, poetic in a pathetic sort of way. Marlowe's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, the muscles in his arm tensing for the draw. But instead of pulling the weapon, he did something that shocked everyone, including Blackwood. He smiled. It was not a friendly smile. It was a cold, dangerous, calculating smile, the one that legends were built on, the one that reminded everyone present exactly why men had feared him across 3 territories. "Silas," he said, his voice calm and carrying, a stark contrast to the impending violence. "Before you start shooting up my town, there's something you should know about that debt you're so worried about collecting." Blackwood's confidence wavered, a barely perceptible tightening around his eyes. "What are you talking about, Thorne? Your gold paid the debt. This is about something else now. The money your gambling house took from Cordelia's guardian," Marlowe continued, letting the words hang in the air. "It came from stolen silver, federal silver, which makes you, and every man riding with you, accessories to a federal crime." The revelation hit Blackwood's men like a bucket of ice water. A visible ripple of unease passed through the line of riders. Suddenly, the odds weren't looking quite so favorable. Blackwood's face went white as fresh snow. The silver mine robbery 3 months ago had been the talk of the territory. Federal marshals were still scouring the land, hunting the men responsible, and the substantial reward money had every bounty hunter from Denver to Santa Fe asking questions. "You're lying," Blackwood snarled, but his voice lacked conviction. He shot a nervous glance at his men, who were already exchanging uneasy looks, their loyalty to a boss who might get them all hanged, visibly evaporating. Marlowe reached slowly into his vest pocket, his movements deliberate, measured, and he pulled out a small, heavy object. It was a single silver ingot, still bearing the faint but unmistakable stamp of the Federal Mint. He held it up where everyone could see it gleaming in the dying light. "Found this in your gambling house safe 2 weeks ago," Marlowe said calmly. "Been wondering what to do with it ever since. Funny thing about federal silver. It has a way of making people remember things they'd rather forget." The lie rolled off Marlowe's tongue as smooth as silk, but it landed with the force of a sledgehammer. He had, in fact, taken the silver from a sample at his own legitimate mining claim days ago. A simple piece of rock he'd intended to have assayed. But Blackwood didn't know that. None of them did. The mere possibility of federal involvement was a specter that haunted every outlaw, a crime that brought a different, more relentless kind of justice. 3 of Blackwood's riders, the ones furthest to the right, were already backing their horses away from the confrontation. Federal crimes meant federal hangings, and no amount of money paid by a local tyrant was worth dancing at the end of a U.S. Marshal's rope. The smart ones knew when to cut their losses and run. "Even if that's true," Blackwood said desperately, his voice cracking, "it don't change nothing. The girl still owes me, and I mean to collect." "No," Sheriff Morton interrupted, stepping forward with a newfound authority, his rifle held steady. "She don't owe you nothing, Silas. A debt based on stolen money ain't legal, and you know it. It's void." Cordelia watched in amazement as her father's masterful gamble played out. Without firing a single shot, he had dismantled Black Army, turning a dozen armed men into a handful of increasingly nervous criminals. But she could see in Blackwood's eyes that desperation was making him dangerous in a whole new way. A cornered rat will always bite. Blackwood's hand moved decisively to his gun, his face twisting with the agony of rage and public humiliation. "I don't care about federal silver or legal debts. I came here for the girl, and I ain't leaving without her." The remaining 6 men with Blackwood tightened their grips on their weapons, but their hearts weren't in it anymore. Fighting for their boss was one thing, dying for his wounded pride was something else entirely. Marlowe took a step closer to Blackwood, his gray eyes locked on the other man's face with a laser intensity. "Then you're not leaving at all, Silas." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Everyone present, from the sheriff to the last of Blackwood's wavering men, understood what Marlowe was offering. Single combat, a duel, winner takes all. Loser feeds the vultures. It was an old tradition in the territory, a code of honor respected even by men who respected nothing else. Blackwood's remaining men visibly relaxed. A fair fight between their boss and Marlowe would settle the matter with honor, regardless of the outcome. No one would face federal charges. No one would hang for following orders. The best man would win. But Silas Blackwood had never been interested in fair fights. And what happened next would prove just how far he was willing to go to claim what he believed was his prize. As the two men faced each other in the dusty street, a deadly tableau under the setting sun, neither of them noticed the glint of metal from the flat roof of Henderson's general store, where a hidden rifleman, Blackwood's insurance policy, was taking careful aim. Cordelia's sharp eyes, honed by 20 years of living on the edge of survival, caught the deadly glint from the rooftop just as the hidden rifleman's finger tightened on the trigger. It was a flicker of unnatural light where there should have been only shadow. It was the thing that was out of place, the detail others missed. And right now, what she noticed was about to kill her father. Marlowe, get down, she screamed, her voice tearing through the silence as she threw herself forward, an instinctive, desperate act of protection. The rifle cracked like thunder from above, the sound sharp and final. The bullet, meant for Marlowe's heart, instead caught him high in the shoulder, the force of the impact spinning him around and dropping him to one knee in the dust. Blood immediately began to blossom through the fabric of his shirt, a dark, spreading stain, but he was alive. Barely. Blackwood's face lit up with a savage, triumphant satisfaction. The hidden rifleman had been his insurance policy all along, a way to guarantee victory even if his own courage failed him. Looks like the great Marlowe Thorne ain't so tough after all, he sneered, drawing his Colt, ready to administer the killing blow. But Cordelia was already moving. In one fluid, unbroken motion, she scooped up her father's fallen gun from the dust where he'd dropped it. The heavy Colt felt alien and powerful in her hands. She cocked the hammer and pointed it directly at Blackwood's chest. Her hands were steady. Her gray eyes, once filled with terror, were now blazing with the same cold fire that had made Marlowe Thorne a legend. You want to finish this? She said, her voice quiet but carrying the deadly weight of her conviction. Then finish it, fair. The street erupted into chaos. Sheriff Morton was ducking behind a water trough, trying to spot the hidden rifleman while keeping his own weapon trained on Blackwood's remaining men. The townspeople who had been watching from windows were now scrambling for better cover, and somewhere above them, a killer was reloading for another shot. Blackwood laughed, but there was a hysterical, unhinged edge to the sound now. You think I'm afraid of some girl playing with her daddy's gun? You probably don't even know which end the bullets come out of. Cordelia's response was to cock the hammer with her thumb, the loud metallic click cutting through the noise like a blade. My mother taught me to shoot when I was 12, she said, her voice as cold as a winter morning. She said, a woman in this territory needed to be able to protect herself from men exactly like you. The unshakable confidence in her voice gave Blackwood pause. This wasn't some terrified girl cowering on an auction block. This was Elizabeth, Walsh's daughter, raised hard and taught to survive. The resemblance to her mother, in that moment of defiance, was suddenly, hauntingly unmistakable, and it brought back memories Blackwood had long tried to bury. Marlowe struggled to his feet, using his good arm to steady himself against a hitching post. The world was swimming in a haze of pain and blood loss, but pride and a father's instinct kept him upright. Watching his daughter face down armed killers filled him with a dizzying mix of terror and profound admiration. Cordelia, he said through gritted teeth, you don't have to do this. Get behind cover. Let me handle it. No, she interrupted, her eyes never leaving Blackwood. You've been handling things alone for 20 years. It's time you had someone watching your back. The rifle cracked again from the rooftop, but this time, Sheriff Morton was ready. His own return shot was instantaneous. A choked scream echoed from above, and the hidden gunman tumbled from Henderson's roof, hitting the ground with a final sickening thud. Now it was just Blackwood and his 5 remaining, very nervous riders against a wounded man, a determined girl, and a town that was finally, irrevocably, ready to fight back. But Blackwood still had one more card to play, one last piece of poison to spit before the end. Blackwood's eyes darted around the street, desperately calculating his dwindling options. His rifleman was dead. More than half his men had abandoned him. And now, a girl who looked like a ghost from his past was pointing a gun at his heart, with the steady hand of someone who knew how to use it. But Silas Blackwood hadn't survived 20 years in this harsh land by giving up when things got difficult. You want to know something interesting about your precious father? Blackwood called out, his voice a venomous shout meant for Cordelia. Ask him about the Cartwright family. Ask him why he really left civilization behind. Marlowe's face went ashen, a pallor that had nothing to do with blood loss. Don't, he warned, his voice barely a whisper. The name was a key to a locked room in his soul, a room filled with ghosts he had never exorcised. But Blackwood was already talking. His words designed to cut deeper and more cruelly than any bullet. Tell her, Marlowe. Tell your daughter how you killed an entire family, a man, his wife, his 2 boys over a card game. Tell her why there are still bounty hunters looking for you after all these years. Cordelia's gun hand wavered. Just for a second, the image his words painted was so horrific. But she didn't lower the weapon. She looked from Blackwood's gleeful, hateful face to her father's tormented one. I don't care what he did before, she said, her voice ringing with a simple, powerful truth that astounded them all. I care about who he is right now. That simple statement of grace hit Marlowe like a physical blow. After 20 years of carrying a burden of guilt and shame so heavy it had driven him into exile, his daughter, a stranger he had just met, was offering him something he'd never dared hope for. Forgiveness without explanation, acceptance without conditions. It was a gift so profound it momentarily cleared the pain from his mind. Sheriff Morton used the distraction to move closer to Blackwood's remaining men, his rifle now aimed squarely at them. It's over, boys, he called out, his voice leaving. No room for argument. Your boss is done, and you know it. Right away now, and nobody else has to die today. 3 more riders exchanged glances and, without a word, quietly backed their horses away from the confrontation. They had signed on to intimidate a small town, not to die for their boss's ancient history and wounded pride. Only 2 men remained at Blackwood's side, and their loyalty was looking shakier by the minute. Blackwood's desperate gamble had failed. Instead of turning Cordelia against her father, his revelation had only strengthened her resolve. The girl standing before him wasn't just Elizabeth's daughter, she was Marlowe's too, with all the stubborn courage and fierce loyalty that implied. Last chance. Silas, Marlowe said, struggling to stay upright, his voice regaining some of its strength. Right away now, and we'll call it even. Stay and finish this, and only one of us is walking away. For a long, stretched moment, Blackwood hesitated. He could see the writing on the wall. His men were abandoning him, the town was against him, and his chances of winning a straight fight were getting worse by the second. A smart man would have cut his losses, swallowed his pride, and lived to fight another day. But Silas Blackwood had never been accused of being smart, only cruel. I'd rather die than be humiliated by some bastard child and her outlaw father. He snarled, finally snapping, and raised his gun toward Cordelia. He never got the chance. To fire. 3 shots rang out, so close together they sounded almost like one. One from Cordelia's steady hand, one from Marlowe's pained but resolute effort, one from Sheriff Morton's decisive rifle. Silas Blackwood pitched backward into the dust, his weapon unfired, his eyes wide with the ultimate surprise. His reign of terror was finally, and violently, ended. His last 2 men immediately threw down their weapons and raised their hands high in the air, their faces masks of relief. They had no intention of dying for a dead boss. The street fell, profoundly silent, the echoes of the gunshots fading into the vastness of the desert. The only sounds were the ragged, labored breathing of Marlowe Thorne and the distant, mournful whistle of wind through the alleyways. Cordelia lowered her father's gun, the heavy weapon suddenly feeling like an impossible weight. She rushed to his side as he finally sank to his knees in the dust, his strength giving out. We need to get you to Doc Henderson, she said, her voice thick with emotion as she supported his weight with a surprising strength. In a minute, Marlowe gasped, looking up at his daughter, his gray eyes full of wonder, pain, and a fierce, undeniable pride. First, I need to say something. Something I should have said 20 years ago. What's that? She whispered, her tears finally falling, tracing clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. I'm sorry, he said, his voice choked with 2 decades of regret. I'm sorry, I wasn't there. And I'm proud. I'm proud as hell to be your father. Ass. The sun began to set over Copper Ridge, painting the sky in brilliant, bleeding shades of gold and crimson. A father and daughter finally found each other in the aftermath of violence and loss. The town would rebuild. The dead would be buried. Life would go on, as it always did. But for Marlowe and Cordelia Thorne, this was not an ending. It was the beginning of making up for lost time. The first day of a future they would build together, a family forged not just by blood, but in the crucible of the Old West.